This is Bhakti Vaishnav. I'm not able to share my screen because somebody else is already sharing it. So I would request. Okay,
Um,
now I'm.
okay,
Yes,
it
yes.
should be working now.
Yeah, I think now it is.
Yes, we
I
can
think
see it.
yes, yes. So as Madam has already introduced my topic, I'm going to talk about this work by the contemporary fictional and non writer of fiction and non-fiction Amitav Ghosh, who writes in his non-fiction that is titled Nutmeg's Curse about the history of colonization in Javanese island and how it has uh, set the motion of colonization in with its grand propensity and links it with the environmental issues of today and how he links the need of speaking out or speaking about or representing the voices of non-human entities in order to find solutions regarding environmental issues that we are facing these days. So I begin with this background, uh, which says that uh, Stanford University Team and as discussed by Robert Macfarlane, we have entered another epoch of the earth and we belong to the generation Anthropocene. I know or I believe that most of us who are attending this conference are quite familiar with the word Anthropocene. So I am not going into the details of the word, but we all know with the Anthropocene is quite very much present all around us these days, right from the flooding in Europe or the hurricane in the Europe and the flooding in New Zealand or maybe floods in Bangladesh and all those natural man-made disasters that are happening around us are result of this Anthropocene. It has emerged as an influential term in the field of literature and cultural studies in terms of its application as a critical tool, more so since 2016. But in the year 2003, Australian philosopher Glenn Albrecht coined the term solastalgia, that means the form of psychic or existential distress caused by environmental change. On the other hand, through an analysis that bridges non-fiction and fiction, Gib Prettyman argues that the Anthropocene challenged conceptions of what it means to be human, forcing us to, I quote, unsee our traditional perceptions of self separation from our environment and work to perceive more accurately our intra-active entanglement with matter. Some of the contemporary writers are occupied with this intra-active entanglement and solastalgia when they are writing about the Anthropocene, and Amitav Ghosh is one of such writers. So let us begin by knowing this island about which we are going to talk about, or we are going to refer when we are discussing his work. This is an island set in Indonesia. It is surrounded by other islands, and the islands are named Banda Islands, and it is the place from where the journey of nutmeg started. Amitav Ghosh traces its history and the trade of nutmeg through centuries and mentions the references in various forms of literature as well as in other documents as well. And he shows how this small commodity traveled all over the world before the people who came as invaders or traders of this commodity to this island. This commodity was already making its name and it was very much present everywhere. Uh, so this is about Javanese island, Banda Island. Uh, Now the work begins with the fall of the Banda Island, and it begins with the incident on the April night of April 21st, 1621, when this Dutch soldier called Snoek was startled by fall of the lamp, and he thought that the village or the islanders that they had been surrounded by had uh, had kind of conspired to attack them while they were asleep. Uh, and they started uh, a mass shooting without taking or without kind of telling the facts, because they were already in mood of invading the island, and they had already issued the notices to the islanders, and the negotiations were still on. But this people who had come from Europe, they were kind of under this inhibition that this people, the natives might protest and they might retaliate. So this simple fall of lamp that happened by coincidentally became the torch of the entire burning of this island. And Amitav Ghosh then, uh, typically in his ways, weaves the threads of this mass uh, murder of these people in on island, uh, by taking examples all over the world. And he also begins by giving accounts of this uh, uh, entire event that took place, and that became the first step of Dutch having the ownership of the island uh, in a successive manner. And he says that this is how these things happened. So the negotiations that took place, the trade requests that were made, and then this fall of lamp, and then the mass shooting, and then how the elderly of the islands were captured, and 38 villagers were subjected to torture, and the remaining were shot or they were burnt alive, and the ones who managed to run away in the far forest, later on they were found out, and they either succumbed to starvation or diseases, or surrendered to this Dutch army, uh, against whom this native people who had just stones and spears could not stand. So this is how he shows the beginning of this project of mass colonization in search that begin with the search of spices. uh, he also links this entire event and history of massacre and capturing island in 10 weeks that happened within 10 weeks by the Dutch, and links it with the Picket War of 1636-38, the first genocidal war by the people in uh, English in North America. Interestingly, he brings out the fact that the Dutch-English rivalry over Manhattan culminated in the Treaty of Breda, Breda Island, which talked about Treaty of Breda, which comprises of island of Run being transferred to Dutch colony, and handing over of the New Amsterdam, that is known as New York currently, to the English colony. Here, interestingly, with this treaty, British claim in Maluku Island, that is surrounding of the Banda Island, um, where it came to an end. It and now English imperialism focused more on the Indian subcontinent. Now, while doing this whole thing, he also traces the etymology and the convenient adaptation of the word massacre by the British to accelerate their project of colonialism under the garb of victimhood. He then goes on to talk about the epistemic violence of colonialism, and he talks about how the central uh, word for uh, colonialism was subjugation and subdue. The word subdue was the keyword recurring again and again in reference to humans, but also to the terrain. He refers to lot many evidences and documents that talk about this necessity to subdue the people of the newly found land, and even the terrains that need to be subdued. Subjugation of not only the brutes and the savages, I quote unquote, but also of non-human beings like trees, animals, and landscapes. He links Asian colonization and exploitation with the terraforming of Native America, and he also refers to the thinkers that sorry he also refers to the thinkers like Francis Bacon and others who kind of supported uh, the project of colonialism, and who said that there is no harm in killing this people who they should be removed from the faces of the earth. And there were others also who supported this argument, that uh, during that time especially. And he proves that how these philosophers and thinkers of this time were part of this project, and coincided with the fall of Banda, and how these people of great respect were really supporting and speaking in favor of removing this humans and non-humans, or controlling these humans and non-humans in favor of their project of colonialism, in the name of removing these brutes and savages from the faces of the earth. So here he is quoting, and I quote, the person called Kit Carson's commanding officer, person called James Carton, who said, in their appointed time, God wills that one race of men, as in the races of lower animals, shall disappear off the face of the earth and give place to another race. The races of mammoths and mastodons and great sloths came and passed away. The red man of America is passing away. He is referring to the colonization project in the Native America, the Northern America, and the way uh, European colonization was kind of using various forces to control and take over the natural and human resources of that land. And he repetitively uses this word called epistemic violence of colonialism, because this was an informed project, it was with purpose, and there was no way that no, there is no way that they can prove that it was not a systematic uh, approach of annihilating an entire race from the face of earth. They kind of thought it as their own privilege, and they were being as if they were chosen to do so in their approach. Then he unravels the link. I have already referred to this word called terraforming, which is derived from a science fiction, and that means that when you are trying to create or transform a land or a landscape to suit your own purpose, or changing it with a purpose. Now, terraforming in reference to colonization happened with a very negative sense of the word. It was not to create or construct something new, but to use everything that was available to the advantage of the colonizer. So, what uh, Gib Prettyman's use of our traditional perception of self-separation from our environment is applicable here when we use or talk about the terraforming, because the colonizers, when they came to this land, the newly found lands, their approach or their traditional perception was that they self was separated from their the new environment. So this is the approach Prettyman is talking about, that we need to change. And what was this approach? Terraforming perceived the world as resource. It it see I mean it saw landscape as factories, and nature as something very subdued and cheap. And here Amitav Ghosh says that as it happened in the Banda Island and all over the world, he gives lots of examples from America, Africa, Brazil, India, and of course Banda Island, that how this terraforming systematically eradicated people and human and non-human beings from their regions. Now, this was not just limited to humans, but he gives lot of examples, and he gives examples like how when the Europeans, especially the English, when they came to America, They also brought along with them their fences and the courtyards and their cattle. So the Native Americans, they were so used to having their own cattle or their own animals. The animals from Europe and the animals from the Native America were pitted against each other, and towards the end, of course, the ruler always wins. So the colonizers managed to uh, transform the land in order to suit their lifestyle, and they needed courtyards, they needed verandas, and they needed fences for their cows and their dogs, whereas these people uh, used their own animals who were not so domesticated, or who were not so familiar with the British ways of living, and that's why the Britishers announced prices. And Ghosh gives an example of an event where 10, uh, 1.5 million buffaloes were slaughtered because they were coming in their way and they were grazing on the land which Britishers wanted to have for their own cattle. So this is how systematically the landscapes and the animals of the native land were removed from the colonies one by one. Similarly, when Banda Island was captured, VOC, the company that took charge of the trade of nutmeg and clove, nutmeg and maize from Banda Islands, they systematically renamed the botanical entity, that is nutmeg. They tried to give it scientific name, but they lose the sense of the importance that this native attached with this botanical product of their island. For them, it was not just an botanical product, but it was part of their living. And Ghosh also gives example of how this island was part of, I mean, is a was an ideal example of interdependence of humans and non-human entities, right from the volcanoes that led to the birth of this island, and the ashes and the soil quality that gave birth to the trees like nutmeg, and how they played an important role, and how their songs and stories revolved around I mean, how the stories and songs of these people, the native people, revolved around these botanical entities. The Westerners completely failed to notice that, and they just saw it as a commodity, and they started to exploit it to that extent that uh, the they did not pay attention to how to preserve or conserve this tree in a way where they could uh, uh, not just benefit, but where they could just get the feel of the real uh, relationship between the humans and the non-humans. So, terraforming basically was the approach of the West while propagating or while accelerating their colonization project that reshaped the entire earth and the landscape of all the colonies that they had. Uh, Coming next is that then um, Amitav Ghosh talks about the fact that uh, he begins with the simple incident, and he says that while the Europeans, especially the Dutch, they were trying to control the produce and the trade of nutmeg, some of the French and other people, they had already smuggled the seed, and nutmeg was being uh, cultivated in other parts of the world as well. And suddenly, some other islands are getting, some other islands started producing nutmeg, and there was the fierce competition faced by Dutch in this. And that is what Amitav Ghosh says, that it was a Schadenfreude of nutmeg, where it really took pleasure. The tree, if it were an entity, it took pleasure in looking at the failure of VOC in controlling and entitlement of the produce that this tree had. So Amitav Ghosh says that, he now systematically shows that how humans, when they try to control the non-human entities, we do not realize that non-human entities, whether they are tree or any other animals, some of them have been there on the earth before us, and they know how to survive our tortures, and they have uncanny ways of in manifesting and surviving our tortures and striking back. So what he says is that he gives example of Gaia, and he says that the Mother Earth that is there, we need to talk about Mother Earth, and we need to uh, uh, think about the monstrous Gaia, the story and the myth he gives example of, and he says that this is something that is happening to our contemporary world, where the Mother Nature is striking back with all its strength, all her strength, and she's kind of uh, establishing her power and control over humanity in our arrogance and in our um heedless run or race in controlling nature and terraforming. We probably forgot that ultimately there are entities in this world that can overpower our understanding, especially the so-called notion of mechanistic modernism, as puts it, that propels the entire uh, existence and the discourse of contemporary development era, where people think that the modern mechanistic uh, way of living is the only living that can be thought of, where nature is against humans, and human nature relationship are seen as rivals and not as uh, codependent or interdependent or in sync. So he talks about this monstrous Gaia and gives examples of things that are happening all over the world. And he says that there are biopolitical warfare that has been already initiated by this uh, uh, climate crisis. So he gives example of the pandemics and the pathogen that happened in 2020, and he talks about coronavirus manifesting all over the world, and he says that this is something very similar, where like Nutmeg, virus is also showing us how this world is beyond our control and how ultimately everything is connected. The world cannot be divided on the basis of the people who are developed and people who are underdeveloped or are still developing. When nature decides to do something, she can do it on her own and universally. Uh, he also talks about pathogen and settlers companion species, in the sense that he says that when terraforming was taking place, pathogens were specially introduced to the locals, and the people suffered from diseases, and the races were wiped out. So we know that it happened that way. Uh, I want to quote one of his arguments. He says the long-term impacts of disease, livestock, and land clearances manifested silently and invisibly. They represented, so to speak, a passive front of conflict in which destruction was affected through mediated fashion through non-human beings and forces. As I already gave example, that the kettles, the pathogens, and the fierce species, the some of the plants, they were specially introduced to overpower or eliminate the the existing or the local native plants. So he also talks about uh, the worldwide adoption of colonial methods of extraction and consumption. Now, the model of this mechanistic modernity that was propelled and introduced by industrialization, Western industrialization, so to speak, were also introduced to the colonies. Now, once the colonies got liberated or became independent, they also joined in this race of becoming more developed, more advanced, and more technologically equipped. So, there is this worldwide adoption of colonial methods of extraction and exemption, consumption. So, we know that there is a consumerist approach everywhere and materialistic approach towards the life all over the world. And we all are facing that, and the relation between the materialistic way of living the life, industrialization, and unsustainable technological race, where it is leading all of us, we all know. So I'm not getting into details of that, but he does establish this relationship, and he talks about the fact that uh, even if we look at it from uh, the point of view of the natives, or the 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 natives that were removed, or the natives who are still there and who are trying to negotiate their worldview with the so-called developed or modern worldview, he asks a very pertinent question, and he says, what does it mean to live on earth as though it were Gaia? That is to say, a living, vital entity in which many kinds of beings tell stories. And how does the planetary crisis appear when seen from this perspective? So he talks about this need to see and perceive the world or the earth as Gaia, which is full of vitality, which is full of this energy, and which is telling us so many stories. Only thing is that we human beings have only our language, and we think that the other entities don't have stories, or they don't have any energy or vitality. In our haughtiness to control the nature, we forget that nature has her own powers. And uh, the people who, like the writers of Falling Sky, Yanomami Shaman and Davi Kopenawa, they have talked about it in their book called The Falling Sky, where they are talking about how this native culture, which are which is rejected by the Western doctrine or Western system of knowledge, they they produce a counter narrative, counter discourse that talk about nature or earth as Gaia, and the need to sustain it, to sustain our own existence. So he says that the dynamics of the things are changing all around the world, but the thing that remains as a fact is that when we talk about history, or when we think of nature as something that we need to nature as something that needs it's controlled or is being exploited, we generally think that this notion of modernism, or the achievement in modernism, is that we are no longer uh, mm, a kind of slave, or we are no longer kind of dependent on the uh, mm, energies, or the forces of nature. But on the other hand, if we look at it closely, he says, I quote, it might be said that the page has been turned on that chapter of history, that the 21st century bears no resemblance to the long ago time when plants and botanical matter could decide the fate of human beings. The modern era, it is often asserted, has freed humanity from the earth and propelled it into a new age of progress in which human made goods take this precedence over natural products. But he says the trouble is that none of the above is true. As for the circulation of the goods, in that too fossil fuels vastly outweigh any category of human made goods. And that is what where the problem arises. When he says that uh, that you know the then he goes into describing the vast and complicated channels and ways in which the current imperialism works, that dominate and control the production and dissemination of oil over the world all over the world. and how then again the product of nature, oil, plays a very vital role in the entire debate of climate change and how it is just an eyewash. Uh, he says he talks about the climate crisis, and then he talks about the fossil fuel problem, and how we need to change it, and then how the countries like India and China, they have uh, potential of turning the tables other way around, but uh, unfortunately it doesn't happen so. And China and India, he talks about the fact that while in this race of going for renewable energy, China in turn instead ended up being the largest importer of the oil in producing the goods for the developed countries in a race to become economically advanced state. So I quote him when he says the net result is a world on its head. 5 centuries of history going back to geopolitical rivalries over the control of cloves, nutmegs, and paper have given the world's most advanced countries a strategic interest in perpetuating the global fossil fuel regime. Conversely, this history has given rising powers like China and India an important strategic incentive to move to renewables. Uh, the conclusions are that in this series of discussion, what Amitav Ghosh tries to do is he systematically and factually reiterates the well-established yet purposefully hidden truth about the link between colonization and contemporary climate crisis. The colonialism of the past was propelled and sustained by the greed of controlling and exploiting the natural and botanical resources like the spices, opium, teak, and tea, etc., led to the major imbalance and devastation of environment, which was further damaged by the exploitation and control of another natural resource, namely oil, in the 20th century, which again put together have escalated and culminated in an imminent climate crisis and climate catastrophes. Thirdly, he says that we need to have a non-Western outlook towards the human-non-human relationship and how the project of European colonization ruthlessly suppressed, subdued, and subjugated any such worldview in colonies in the East and West alike. He also emphasizes on the intrinsic relationship between human and non-human existence and the need to conserve and comprehend the songs and stories that celebrate, exemplify, and sustain the ecological balance through this narrative that need to bring in geopolitics, empire, and question of power in the discussion of climate crisis. I want to quote three of his quotes uh, from this book, which generally sums up his major three arguments regarding climate change and history and like the way I put it, the unraveling link, history, and the climate crisis. The first is that Banda Island, I quote, might be read as a template for the present if only we knew how to tell that story, I unquote. The second one, he says, the planet will never come alive for you unless your songs and stories give life to all the beings, seen and unseen, that inhabit a living earth, Gaia. And the third point he makes is, I quote, the question of who is brute and who is fully human, who makes meaning and who does not, lie at the core of planetary crisis. I can quote. Last but not the least of his contribution and his argument is that we need to have a counter narrative of Gaia as agency that is striking back in the form of planetary crisis and the resultant disasters, pandemics, and migration that are unsettling the world and need to take cognizance of the original worldview of the native in times of unsustainable development and imperialism as an answer to solastalgia that we all face, knowingly or unknowingly. Uh, I conclude with the quote by which with which he ends the book with, I quote, "And as these events intensify, they add ever greater resonance to voices that stubbornly continued to insist that non-humans can, do, and must speak. It is essential now, as the prospect of planetary catastrophe comes ever closer, that those non-human voices be restored to our stories. The fate of humans and all our relatives depends on it." I unquote. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Now we can have questions from our audience. Okay, seems like we don't have any more questions. So if you come up with anything, feel free to contact Mrs. Vaishnav through the chat as long as she is here. Otherwise, thank you for your wonderful presentation. And now we will have a 20-minute break and then we will continue with the next session. So goodbye for now.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.